your attention, please. I would like to welcome you all wholeheartedly to our 11th Tom Hurndall Memorial Lecture. I'm happy that you made your way here to MMU for our annual memorial event. My name is Christian Klesse. I'm a senior lecturer in sociology at MMU, and I'm also a member of the Tom Hurndall Memorial Committee, which is comprised of a number of academics and postgraduate students at Manchester Metropolitan University and at other universities in the Northeast. This event has been going on for many years now to remember the life and activism of a student who was also a student at Manchester Metropolitan University. Tom Hurndall was a student of photography, journalism, and he was shot on the 11th of April 2003 when he was part of a peace protest in the Gaza Strip, and he was shot by a sniper of the Israeli Defense Forces. He had been an activist for some years. He joined the Human Shields in Iraq before the 2003 Iraq War, and later on joined the International Solidarity Movement and supported their peace activism in Gaza. He was shot while he was involved in setting up a peace tent to block Israeli army tanks. He was shot in the attempt to shield children from snipers. Since 2005, we host the annual Tom Hurndall Memorial Lecture at Manchester Metropolitan University. This is our 11th event, and over the years the committee has been able to invite prestigious speakers who have talked on the occupation and the oppression in Israel and Palestine, in order to keep alive the memory of Tom Hurndall and of his engagement through a critical discussion of issues relating to the conflict. I would like, before I will introduce our speaker, Dr. Hanieh from London. I would like to fill you in on a few developments, and we also have people who would like to make a few announcements related to Palestine solidarity activism. So first of all, you may remember that in the 10th years of this lecture, in the 10th years of the death of Tom Hurndall, we had a memorial prize competition. Due to a donation by the Lippmann Miliband Trust, we were able to ask students to design a memorial for Tom Hurndall, which will be set up and installed in All Saints Park, just a few hundred yards down the road. Last year, the prize went to Era Capellan, for the best and most convincing memorial design, and her design, a tree wrap, has been completed. The work is completed. At the moment, there's still negotiation about where exactly in the park it will be installed, and hopefully within a few weeks' time there will be a public memorial for Tom Hurndall. We will keep you informed through a press release or maybe an event to celebrate the creation of this memorial. Yes, and at this moment I'd like to Adi and others who had a few events to announce, maybe to step in.
Just very briefly, Marcel Khalifa, world famous concert performer, composer, musician, is going to be in Manchester, incredibly, on April the 3rd. Flyers will be going around. Please do spread as far and wide as you can. It's a once in a lifetime opportunity to see him So, yeah, please get on this. It's a wonderful thing. And there's also about the Women's International Day.
Yeah. Okay. This Saturday, March the 5th, will be Palestine Solidarity Campaign and Northern Women for Palestine's event for International Women's Day. It will be at the Cross Street Chapel, starting at 1 o'clock, and there will be food, films, speakers, workshops, and our focus for this year will be trauma and resilience. So trauma experienced by Palestinian women and children, and their forms of resilience that help them in their day-to-day lives living with daily trauma. One of our films is from a Palestinian psychotherapist who's made a film for us talking about this particular issue. It's a mixed event, so men and women, it's not women only, and we'd love to see you. Apparently Cross Street Chapel at the moment is encased in a cage again. Thought it had gone when they sorted out the cemetery, but apparently this is for the metro. So you can get round it and come in through the side door that takes you straight through where the round chapel is, or the corridor, into the main room that we will be having, which is the room that adjoins the kitchen, so that we can serve food. So it's 1 till 5, Norma? Yeah, it'll be 1 till 5. We've got some wonderful footage that I'm sure people will get a lot from. I'm very hesitant to say enjoy, given the issues, but well worth seeing. And we are hoping that everybody who comes will really enjoy the event. On Sunday, the Saddleworth Women's Palestine's Scholarship Fund group, who raise money for women in Gaza to go to university and further education in Gaza, are having their International Women's Day at the Methodist Church Hall, on the main street in Uppermill. And that, what time is that, Kathy?
No, it's 1:45, start 2:10.
Right, very precisely.
Some people get there on time.
Yeah, because that group is also part of Northern Women for Palestine, and these events are happening over the week from Saturday till the 13th of March in York and Bradford, Sheffield, Halifax, Saddleworth and Manchester. So, and we're all got the same theme, and we're using the same resources but in slightly different ways in each place. So there's information. Please come and talk to us if you're interested. We'd love to see you. On the 13th of March, to finish our International Women's Day celebrations, we have Reem Kalani. If people haven't seen her, you don't know what you've missed. She's going to be singing at the Cross Street Chapel. She's going to be singing at the Square Chapel in Halifax. But on Saturday in Bradford will be the main event of our week, which will be all afternoon and then a meal in the evening. The afternoon event, workshops, Reem will be leading a singing workshop. That will be women only. But in the evening, we will welcome our male comrades to come and share a lovely meal with us. So that's in Bradford on Saturday. And I was going to mention Marcel Khalifi, but Amy's done it. So the stuff is on
tickets for Saturday night.
I have got tickets for the Saturday night meal. So if anybody wants them, please come and see me. But please celebrate International Women's Day, because Palestinian women celebrate it every single year with marches and parties and demonstrations, as do women all over the world. But it's really important to Palestinian women, so come and share it with us. I think that's it. Is it Norma? We've done everything?
Yeah, one more.
Hi, I'm from Manchester Palestine Solidarity Campaign. Our next public meeting, hopefully, if you haven't got one of these, I can give you another flyer, or you can look this up on the internet or on Facebook. We've got a report back from a guy who spent 3 months in the West Bank. It's on the 17th of March at 7 o'clock in Friends Meeting House. And I'd like to hand over to my colleague to talk about Big Ride. Thank you.
So last year, 200 people cycled from Edinburgh to London over 9 days to raise the fight for the Palestinian people and to raise money for the Middle East Children's Alliance. This year, it's actually going to be a series of 2 to 3 day cycle rides, so it's slightly more appealing. So 6th, 7th and 8th of August. and it's a kind of focus on the arms trade. The UK's involvement in the arms trade. But if anybody would like to know more about it, I'll be here at the end, and Chris and I have leaflets that we can hand out to people.
Okay, yeah, thank you for this announcement. And yeah, now is the moment to introduce our 11th speaker, Dr. Adam Hanieh, who's from London. He's a senior lecturer in development studies and quite active in research and also political work around turmoil and conflict in the Middle Eastern region. Adam Hanieh is a member of the London Middle East Institute. He's an advisory committee member of the Center for Palestine Studies. He's also on the International Advisory Board for the German Studies in Political Economy. And his most recent publications include Lineages of Revolt, Issues in Contemporary Capitalism in Middle East, which has been published by Haymarket Books, and Adam brought a few numbers of copies. He has been working hard, if you can see, to bring them from London here, and he's selling these copies for £10 each. So, publications of his include Capitalism and Class in the Gulf Arab States, Palgrave in 2010, and a co-edited volume, Transit States, Labor Migration in the Gulf, which has been published by Pluto Press. So, let's give a warm welcome to the title of this lecture will be Palestine in the Shadow of Regional Turmoil.
Okay, thank you. I want to begin by thanking very much the organisers and the Foundation for inviting me to speak tonight. It's a really great honour to be here with you in Manchester. I was actually living in Palestine at the time when Tom was shot, and I remember the moment very vividly. I had been living there for about 6 years prior to that, and I remember, the beginning of the Second Intifada. I remember the daily toll we would hear or the hourly toll we would hear on news and radio of people killed, people injured in clashes. I remember the soldiers and tanks outside our houses. And I remember very vividly the way that people struggled to meet and survive everyday tasks. And this was, I think, one of the most powerful experiences of living there at the time. The dignity of a population at that particular moment that could get the little daily tasks done. The feeling that you're one with your neighbours, one with your community. You could knock on anyone's door at any time, and someone would be there to help you with those little tasks. And it's the collective conquering of those daily tasks that I think really is one of the most powerful symbols of what Tom and his actions represent. What Tom did and his solidarity with the Palestinian people was undoubtedly a moment of enormous individual integrity and heroism. But I don't think we should forget that what made that possible was that collective moment at that time in 2003 that actually produced someone like Tom. And I think that's something we should remember. What I want to do tonight is sketch where I think things have gone since those early years in the 2000s, and where we are at today, and as Christian mentioned, put it in the context of the wider region, the Middle East as a whole. I know in many ways this is a bleak story, and I'm sure many of you saw the title of the lecture and thought, wow, this is going to be some bad news. But I want to actually inject, I think, some element of hope into this story of bleakness, into this story of pessimism. I know this might sound strange given what we see on TV, and those of us who visit the region regularly know the difficult situation over there, but I think it's important always to remember that one of the functions of pessimism, one of the functions of these moments of bleakness, is to actually instill a self-reinforcing prophecy. We come to believe that things are so bad, that nothing can be done, that we do nothing, and therefore things remain bad. Things don't change. And I think it's very important that we push back consciously against that kind of pessimism, and realize that there are moments of hope, and that kind of hope comes through collective action, collective practice, collective solidarity. And that's, I think, the theme, or one of the key themes that I want to really emphasize tonight. And to me, that was really what Tom's actions really represented, that moment of collective solidarity, collective hope. The second theme that I want to really emphasize is that Palestine must always be placed in the context of the region, regional and international context. We can't try to understand what is going on in the West Bank and Gaza Strip only looking at these narrow borders, only looking at the borders of these areas. We have to consciously and consistently situate the Palestinian struggle in the dynamics of the Middle East as a whole and within global power dynamics. So that's kind of the second theme that I really want to try to bring out. So I'm going to begin by speaking a little bit about the current situation in the West Bank and Gaza Strip, and then jump out a little bit to the regional context, and then end finally with the if you like, the optimism and those moments of hope that I spoke about earlier. Well, I'm sure we all know since October last year there has been a massive expansion of clashes and of military repression in the West Bank and Palestine associated with the Israeli military. These are probably the most deepest and most prolonged wave of unrest to have occurred in over a decade, and so much so that they've been referred to as the third Intifada. Tom was killed, of course, during the second Intifada, and people have referred to this current wave of protest and repression as the third Intifada. I particularly don't like that term, and for reasons that I'll kind of get to in a second, but it is, I think, an indication of how the scale of what is going on. It is important, however, to situate this moment historically. It tells us a lot, and I want to speak a bit about the character of what is going on at the moment. It has been since October last year. It tells us a lot about what has happened since 2003, 2004, the end of the Second Intifada. It also tells us a lot about the Oslo process, the so-called peace process, and what it has produced on the ground, the context in which Palestinians live today. Over the last decade, there have been two key developments. The first of these is a deepening fragmentation of the Palestinian people. This is a fragmentation that is at the core of the Oslo process. It's a fragmentation that affects all aspects of, or all parts of the Palestinian people, the Palestinian nation. So I'm sure many of you have seen maps like this. There are countless versions of these maps available. This is a map from OCHA, a UN organization. I'm going to be using a few of their statistics over the next slides. This is a map of the West Bank, and I'll speak about this in a second. But I think it's important to note that this division of the West Bank between the Gaza Strip is one aspect or one reflection of this fragmentation. But there are many others. We can speak of the fragmentation of Palestinian citizens of Israel, those who remained after the Nakba in 1948, who retain or who have Israeli citizenship, very much fragmented from the rest of the Palestinian people. We can speak of refugees, whether it be throughout the Arab world, and of course many different experiences of refugees throughout the Arab world, and again obviously denied the right to return home, and again fragmented from the Palestinian people as a whole. We can speak of Palestinians who live in the diaspora, whether it be in the West or other places globally. Again, these Palestinians are fragmented, divided from the Palestinian people as a whole. So this fragmentation is really a key to understanding what is happening today in the Palestinian political spectrum, to understand what is going on today in the West Bank and elsewhere on the ground. This fragmentation is not new. It has been at the core of the Zionist project since before 1948. This attempt to divide, to fracture, to fragment people from one another. Now, in the West Bank, we can see this represented extremely graphically. Those of you who have visited the area will know what this means on the ground. We see the yellowish kind of shading and the darker brown shading where most Palestinians tend to live, and those areas divided from one another by Israeli settlement blocks. You can see the what's called Area C, which is the kind of light blue shading, dominating around 60% of the West Bank. You can see the way that Area C has, if you like, fingers that run into Palestinian populated territories throughout the north of the West Bank. You can see around Jerusalem in the center there, or just under the center, the wall in the black and the red line, the outline of the apartheid wall, which again divides Palestinians from one another. And you can see in the south of the West Bank, again, the same kind of patterns of settlement blocks, Israeli military presence that divide areas from each other. So we have here, in a very graphic picture, I think, this symbol of fragmentation. We can see that to move from Hebron, for example, in the south to Bethlehem, or from Bethlehem to Ramallah, or from Ramallah to Salfit, or Salfit to Nablus, potentially the Israeli military can shut down those routes very, very simply. It has a control over the movement of population that is really being, if you like, an architecture, or a very scientific architecture of control that has developed over the last 2 decades. So this is not a new map. It's not a new situation. It's something that has been developing since the early 90s, but it is a situation that is very much associated with the Oslo process. And this is very, very important to understand. And I'll come back to why this is important in a second. We can see that the second key development that has happened since the Oslo process is, of course, the establishment of the Palestinian Authority in 1994, and its control over those areas, the darker areas, those Palestinian cities I noted, Hebron, Ramallah, Salfit, Nablus, Jenin, and so forth, where the majority of Palestinians in the West Bank actually live. The establishment of the Palestinian Authority is also key to understanding what is going on the ground at the moment. Ironically, perhaps not ironically, but what has happened since the early 1990s and the Oslo process is that the Palestinian Authority has taken more and more attributes or characteristics of a state. The flag, the anthem, running schools, running certain ministries, employing a bureaucracy, and so forth. But as it has taken on these trappings of the state, its actual power, its actual ability to represent the Palestinian population has diminished dramatically. It has become ever more dependent, ever more under the control of the Israeli military occupation. So we have a body that looks more and more, at least on the official, or on the formal level, or the superficial level, like a state, but in reality it has less and less of actually what should constitute any state. Now, one thing I want to point out, and I think this is very important to understand, is that I said the majority of the Palestinian population live in those areas that I pointed out. And you'll notice, of course, in the Jordan Valley, the large swathe of Area C, the blue line, if you like, that joins to Jordan there. Now, that strip of blue, the Jordan Valley, was not always, and it still isn't today, but has largely been depopulated of Palestinians. These empty spaces that we see in the West Bank today were not always empty. They were made empty. They used to hold rich Palestinian farms, Palestinian agriculture. 1967, with the occupation, those areas were slowly encircled and the Palestinian population driven into other areas as well. We often forget this, I think. We think of 1948 as the moment of the expulsion of the Palestinian people from their homes and lands in what became Israel. But the same process was also repeated in 1967. And it is, I think, being repeated in much the same way in parts of Jerusalem, or in Jerusalem particularly, today. Okay, so this is a constant, if you like, another constant of Zionism. It's not just the fragmentation, it's the expulsion, the moving of people into different areas. So what we see today, as I said, is this laying down of the architecture of occupation that permits Israeli military control to be extended over the people at any moment in time. So it's not always the case that it is difficult to move from Hebron to Bethlehem or from Ramallah to Nablus. In fact, it may be quite easy to do so. But the point is that at any moment in time, it's possible to shut down those routes, to clamp down and prevent movement of the population. That is the secret, if you like, of the architecture of occupation. It's that ability to shut down with just a few tanks, just a few checkpoints, the movement of the population. Now, there are other parts to this as well. Of course, the permit system. We've seen the more permanent institutionalization of checkpoints, particularly into Jerusalem. We also need to take into account the control of water supplies, the control of electricity. We can take into account the control of movement of goods and people. All of these aspects reinforce this fragmentation and control within the West Bank. Some of these things I talk about in more detail in my book, but I just want to point out one thing which I think is a nice analogy, if you like, for the Oslo process. And that is the way that electricity works in the West Bank. And we could apply the same thing to water as well. If you're a Palestinian living in Ramallah, say, you will get a bill at the end of each month that says, okay, here is my bill, this is what you owe, okay? It's written in Arabic, it's a Palestinian company that presents you this bill. You pay the bill, and you think, okay, on the surface, I'm paying to a Palestinian entity. In reality, though, the supply of those goods, those key goods, water, electricity, even the internet, phone lines, etc., actually originate with or under the control of Israel itself. Okay, they are the ultimate ones who provide and have the ability to shut down that provision of those goods. So it's, if you like, a nice analogy. It's the Palestinian face behind the Israeli occupation, the Israeli continuing military occupation. So the consequences of this architecture is this isolated patchwork of territories. And what this means is that there is an extremely large divergence of experiences across different parts of the West Bank. The situation, for example, in Ramallah is very different, or can be very different, from what might appear in a village next to Ramallah, or in a village in Bethlehem. Okay? There's large divergences of experiences, depending how you are connected to the Palestinian Authority, connected to international NGOs, and connected to some of the economic processes in the area. So one of the things that we've seen over the last, or since October, this moment of uprising, has been the kind of curious situation where you can be, for example, at one place and appear that your life is going as normal, you're going to school or going to work or whatever, and just a few minutes away there'll be an area under lockdown, there'll be fierce clashes, there'll be people being arrested, people being shot. And this divergence appears, this divergence between normality and this repression appears all over the West Bank. Okay, it is particularly important, of course, to understand the centrality of Jerusalem to this since the beginning of October. Jerusalem is very much, as you can see, the center of the West Bank itself. And I think sometimes when we think of Jerusalem, we think of it in its religious and its important religious significance. But we have to remember that Jerusalem, because it is the center of the West Bank, is actually the artery that matters most to any kind of effective control over the territory. Okay? It is, or has historically been, the economic center of the West Bank. It has historically been the market of the West Bank. But by encircling, and you can see this encirclement with the wall going around East Jerusalem there, cutting off Jerusalem in this way from the hinterland of the West Bank is, if you like, in my opinion, the final part of this architecture of control. It's very, very important. So what has been happening since October has been a consistent, deliberate attempt to push Jerusalemites, Palestinian Jerusalem, the Palestinians who live in Jerusalem, outside of Jerusalem. Deportations have occurred, house demolitions have occurred, more settlement construction, and the deepening and the ending or the finishing of the wall itself. So for this reason, Jerusalem has really been the epicenter, if you like, or one of the epicenters, along with Hebron, where we have an Israeli settler population living smack bang in the middle of the town, has been the epicenter of these clashes. Now, so what I just want to run through a few brief statistics, or if you like, the consequences of this. And these are figures from the middle of February, so a couple of weeks ago. This first one is Palestinian casualties. You can see in 2015 there were 127 deaths in the West Bank, 25 in the Gaza Strip. Since 2016, 28 in the West Bank, 3 in the Gaza Strip, and 7 in this particular week. Injuries also over on this side. Now, these figures really, I think, quite graphically illustrate the scale of what is going on. And I find it quite remarkable that when this has been going on since October. Okay, so what is that now, around 6 months or something like this? This is something that really hasn't touched the news, it hasn't touched the newspapers, it hasn't touched even apparently left liberal newspapers like The Guardian. We don't see it reported at all. Okay, but we are talking in 2016, just the last 2 months, 2 Palestinians killed every 3 days. Okay, 2 Palestinians killed every 3 days. That's the kind of average we've seen, and we've seen this a big spike since 2015. Now, in Gaza, where the intensity of these clashes have been much less, most of those people who have been killed in Gaza have been shot over the border by Israeli military forces over the border. In many ways, I think the lack of any kind of attention to this shows the way that the occupation has become normalized in the way that is presented to the outside world. And I think it's quite dramatic. These figures also are from OCHA, by the way, an excellent website for these kinds of updates. Here are Israeli casualties, 18 in Israel, 5 in Israel, 18 in the West Bank and Gaza, or in the West Bank, in 2015, 3 in 2016. Okay, you can see the massive disproportionality here compared to Palestinian deaths. Here is another one. This is very important, and it speaks to some of the things I was talking about earlier, which is displacement and demolitions, house demolitions, or Palestinian structures being demolished. You can see this, I think, if you compare the figure for 2015, okay, 447 in Area C, that blue area I showed you on the map, 447 Palestinian structures demolished in 2015. We have almost reached that figure in the first month and a half of 2016. Okay, almost reached that same figure. So we see a very sharp increase. This tells you very much, I think, what the intention of the Israeli military response to this has been. Okay, it's to deepen, accelerate this process of displacement. Because obviously, if you destroy someone's house or their dwellings, they have to go somewhere else. Okay, it's part of moving people out. And over here, you can see that reflected very graphically again. Area C, 564 in 2015, 482. We probably have passed that figure by now. Okay, looking at those kinds of trends. You can see again, East Jerusalem is very highly is very importantly represented within this. Okay, so this is another important feature. Obviously, if you're doing these kinds of things, if you are shooting people, if you are demolishing houses, you are also conducting military operations. Okay, and this is another example which I think shows this process. This is on the left, the military incursions into Gaza. Okay, and here in the West Bank, and again you can see that we have the weekly average in this particular week in greater than the weekly average of 2015. So 103 raids or search and arrest operations in the West Bank in this particular week, that first or second week of February. So now what this has meant is, of course, a large spike in the prisoner population. Okay, there are currently around 6,900 Palestinians who are political prisoners detained in Israeli jails. Around 650 of these are administrative detainees, meaning that they have been arrested without trial or without charge. Okay, they are kept in prison without knowing why they're there, and they don't face any kind of court to explain or have any access, even though political prisoners, all Palestinians arrested, go to a military court. So even that itself is, of course, problematic. We need to recognize as well that there are 450 Palestinian children currently in Israeli detention, also political prisoners. Has again been a very large spike in the arrest of children. Okay, which tells us something about the character of these clashes, which I'll come to in a second. And there are also 55 women currently in prison. So these, of course, are associated. These arrests are often associated with these kinds of military searches. Okay, I mentioned Gaza has been less of a focus of the recent period. We know, of course, the regular bombardment that has happened of the Gaza Strip. But I do want to just mention one fact about Gaza, and that is the closure of Rafah, the border crossing with Egypt. The figure of this, I mean, we I think can again forget the way this has been normalized, but since the 24th of October 2014, okay, so that's now what is that, a year and a half ago, okay? Since that period, 24th of October 2014, this crossing, which is basically the only crossing of Gaza with the outside world, has been closed except for 42 days of partial opening, okay? Not full opening, partial opening over that 1.5 year period, okay? So there are about 25,000 people who are urgently waiting to leave for medical reasons and other kinds of reasons. So this is very important to kind of put in the context. In many ways, Gaza is the microcosm of what the West Bank appears to be becoming. These encircled patchwork of territories where movement can be shut down and controlled by the military from the outside. Okay? And Gaza was where this was trialed first, okay? Beginning in the late 1980s, early 1990s. Okay? So this is important. So what does this all tell us about the roots, if you like, and the character of the clashes that we've seen since October 2015? The immediate spark, of course, was the threats to the Dome of the Rock and increased settler violence. But I think really it's important to situate what is happening now within the consequences that or the process, the Oslo process that I spoke a little bit about at the beginning. Okay, this is the consequence of Oslo. Okay, this is the consequence of Oslo. Oslo was never about peace. It is not a peace process. Oslo did not fail. Oslo actually has succeeded. Okay, because what it was intended to do was lead precisely to this kind of situation. Okay, so this is, we hear often in the media, peace process has been a failure, we need to go back to the drawing board, we need to rekindle the spirit of Rabin and in 1993, the famous handshake on the White House lawns. This is not true. Okay, this is actually the process, the intention of Oslo itself. It was used as a means of deepening Israeli control and dispossession. And what it has produced is a situation of complete frustration, a complete lack of any kind of hope in any political future. All right? And this is why the character of these clashes that we see have been very different from the first and the second Intifada. Okay? They have largely been individualized, often young children or young people taking, stabbing or car driving into settlers with cars, or those kinds of individualized random acts, okay, that are really an expression of immense frustration, an expression of immense lack of any kind of hope in a decent future. Okay? Very importantly, within all of this, there is no political leadership or political vehicle or political project that can present any kind of direction to this. This is not being directed by political parties. Okay? That is why we see, for example, the spike in child arrest. That is why we see these kinds of patterns that I've done. It's very much a reflection, if you like, of the current character of Palestinian politics, as well as the outcome of the Oslo process over the last 2 decades. It's a vacuum that I think has been developing since the 1990s, but has really reached its crunch point today. Okay, we are at that moment, I think. So we can talk, I think, in discussion, more in discussion about the character of Palestinian politics and this collapse, this vacuum. I just want to note a couple of points here, and that is, firstly, that the strategy that we see from the Palestinian Authority, particularly Abu Mazen, is very much a reliance upon external actors. It's a reliance, if you like, on the United States or the European Union or the United Nations. It's looking for an external savior, if you like, someone to step in and fix the problem. Okay. Now, this is not just Abu Mazen. I shouldn't say this is a characteristic, I think, of Palestinian politics in general. But I think it really does show that there isn't an independent kind of social base or social movement that we can look to as a Palestinian representative, if you like. Not just in the West Bank and Gaza Strip, but more generally of the Palestinian population across this fragmentation, across these divides that I noted earlier. This is also a moment where we are nearing the transition of leadership within Fatah and within the Palestinian Authority. Okay, Abu Mazen will soon be replaced. Okay, who that will be, we don't know. There are various figures out there who are obviously offering themselves as alternatives. None of them really present, in my opinion, an alternative, any kind of substantive alternative to Abu Mazen in terms of politics. But we are at that moment of transition between a Palestinian political guard and a new leadership. The old has not quite ended, but the new has not appeared. Now, within all of this, I think it's very important to always recognize that Palestinian society in the West Bank has also become highly differentiated. We have the emergence of an elite within Palestinian society that has benefited to some extent from these processes I've described. Okay, and that elite is generally concentrated in Ramallah. So it's not just a question of a lack of political alternative. It's not just a question of the Oslo process producing this kind of situation. It is also a question of the internal differences within Palestinian society being very, very, very stark. Okay, the differences in wealth, the differences in poverty, and the increase in debt. Financial debt for average citizens or average Palestinians living in these areas. Again, this is very visible on the landscape in Palestine. If you go to Ramallah, you go to other areas in Palestine today, you will see big billboards advertising buy a house, down payment, mobile phones, etc., etc. Okay, all of these kinds of things, replacing the political graffiti that was there it's during the Second Intifada and earlier. Okay, it's a transition, or it's a, if you like, a visual representation of a change within Palestinian society as a whole. Again, we can speak to that more in discussion if you like. So I want to come back to the point that the second point that I wanted to make, which is the impact of the regional scale and how we can situate these dynamics locally at the regional scale. Of course, the most important factor here are the uprisings that began in 2010 and through 2011 in Tunisia and Egypt, and then spreading very quickly across the whole of the region. Now, it can again seem, looking back on that moment, and I know if you read some of the analysis on the internet, people will talk about conspiracy theories, they'll talk about these were plots from the outside, etc. But it's important, I think, to remember the hope represented by these movements that emerged in 2011. Okay? This was a moment of hope where there was a breaking apart, if you like, of the kind of autocratic states. There was a challenge to autocratic rule that had not been seen in probably 5 decades. Okay, that kind of level of mass mobilization, mass engagement. They drew protests, particularly in 2011, drew into action millions of people for the first time. And they really did seriously shake these established state structures. The other thing, the fact that these movements were regional, pointed to the commonalities between different countries. The fact that the same kinds of slogans, the same kinds of ways of mobilizing, of organizing, were felt across all countries in the region, really pointed to the commonalities that exist. Now, often I think these uprisings are kind of reduced to a very shallow understanding of, it was just about these autocratic dictators, with kind of democracy versus authoritarianism. I think there's a bigger story to this, which I try to go into in the book, which is looking at how authoritarianism linked with neoliberal reforms, wider economic changes across the region, how these things intersected with US and Western domination of the Middle East. These are not separate items, they're not separate spheres. They are connected, they're part of the same kind of structure of development that we've seen in the Middle East over the last, basically since the 1980s. Okay, so when these movements came onto the streets, their slogans may have been about Mubarak the dictator, they may have been about bread, freedom, social justice, but they were actually expressing this systemic totality, if you like. The fact that the way that Western powers ruled the region, continued to rule the region, the way economies had developed, and the political form were very much interconnected. And this is why these protests were so significant. They shook the established order. They presented the possibility that for the first time in 5 decades, the status quo would not continue as usual. Okay? Now we all know, or at least we can see it represented on TV and so forth, what happened after those first couple of years of optimism. We know, for example, the way that very quickly Western governments stepped in to support new regimes as they came into power, that there wasn't really any kind of change in the states and the elites that were running places throughout the region. We saw the entry of international financial institutions back with loans, loan programs, structural adjustment programs that differed nothing from that earlier, the earlier period prior to 2011. We saw, of course, military and political intervention in places like Libya, and very importantly, Saudi Arabia's intervention in Bahrain, crushing the uprising in Bahrain, very important and often forgotten. That is a critical moment as well. And most starkly and most significantly, the devastation caused by the Assad regime in Syria, among the Syrian population. Millions displaced and hundreds of thousands dead. So this if you like, I think is really deepened this sense of despair, if you like, from that initial moment of optimism to this current situation where there doesn't appear to be much hope. We can talk about this more in discussion, and there's obviously lots of differences among the region, but I just want to make the point that I think is very important, is that the political weaknesses of the movements that emerged in 2011 and 2012 has been their inability to really confront regional and global power across the region as a whole. We tend to look at the Middle East through the lens of nation states. We think we can understand what is happening in Egypt through looking at what's going on in Egypt. We tend to think we can understand Jordan through just looking at Jordan. I think what we have learnt in such a stark manner in the last 5 years is that the regional dynamics, the cross-regional dynamics, are absolutely key to understanding what goes on inside the nation state. Okay? We can see that very starkly. In the case of Egypt, we can see the way that the Gulf states, Saudi Arabia in particular, has played a key role in turning back in turning back those mass movements that emerged in 2011 and 2012. Obviously, most importantly, with the military coup by Sisi in 2013. Okay, what has happened since that coup has been that the Gulf states have, of course, supported the military and supported a very sharp crackdown on the population, the Egyptian population. So I think we need to move away from looking at the region as just an agglomeration of nation states and try to understand these regional dynamics. And I think this is extremely true in the case of Palestine. And this, I think, is one thing that we don't recognize enough. Obviously, the strategic position of the Israeli state within the Middle East, in terms of Western power, particularly the United States, continues to endure. There are perhaps differences they might emerge between the US and Israel around Iran and other things, but in general, that alliance remains extremely solid. Okay, the US remains extremely solid. But what 2011 represented was a shaking of the stability of that system. It shook the major allies of Israel, Egypt, Tunisia, Tunisia to a less extent, but Egypt in particular. Jordan was also shook by these kinds of uprisings. It presented a challenge to these regional configurations of power. And that is why it's quite stark to see the realignment of regional power in the most recent 2 years. We see the confluence of interests, if you like, between the Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, Israel, and new military regimes such as the Sisi regime in Egypt. Okay? They're basically on the same page. Yes, they might have differences over one question or the other, but they basically want this to be, they want to put the genie back in the bottle. Okay? And that's what they've attempted to do. So how can we link all of this to the dynamics on the ground in Palestine? I think in the case of Palestine, we also often forget the regional scale. We try to understand what is happening in Palestine just through what's going on in the West Bank or what is going on in Gaza, forgetting that these other regional struggles are very much part of what will change the situation for Palestinians on the ground. Okay? This, in particularly, I'm speaking of Egypt here. Egypt as one of the key strategic links. If we had seen a different outcome in the case of Egypt, then the Palestinian struggle today would be vastly different. Okay? Not just for Gaza, but for the Palestinian people as a whole. We have to internalize, I think, that message very, very deeply. So, I promised some optimism in all of this, and I'm going to end with just a couple of things. Where does the optimism come in this obviously bleak situation? The first point that I want to make, there's 2 points that I'm going to make. The first one is that the regional, this regional configuration that I've said has largely, if you want to call it a counter-revolutionary process, or this reconstitution of those old regimes post-2011, it may appear to be strong, but I believe in actual fact it's quite brittle. Okay? In the sense that if we look again to somewhere like Egypt, we see enormous levels of repression. We see new laws coming out preventing public demonstrations. We see the reconstitution of military courts and military trials and so forth. But at the same time, we see, just in the last couple of weeks, new protests beginning to emerge. This is a regime that does not have deep popular roots. Okay? It's a regime that even among itself is quite divided. Okay? That's quite clear, I think, that within the regime itself there are differences of opinion of how far to go, how much repression can the population tolerate. So in many ways it's a brittle kind of base. We can see also somewhere like Saudi Arabia a similar kind of brittleness, particularly in the context of low oil prices. I'm not saying the monarchy is going to fall tomorrow, and I think there's a lot that, a long way before that will happen. But we do see a regime that we haven't seen in such a long time, lacking any kind of popular legitimacy and facing kinds of movements emerging, and particularly I think it's going to become more difficult for Saudi Arabia to continue to play the role it has in the environment of low oil prices. So the point that I'm making here is that I don't think 2011 was a one-time event or an event that will only happen, it won't happen again for the next 50 years. I think lessons that have been internalized from 2011, the experiences that people have gone through, remain. It was an immensely transformative time, and those lessons have not been lost. People remain and are thinking through these kinds of questions. So I am confident, I'm not going to make a prediction when, but I am confident that we will see another challenge to these kinds of regimes that may hopefully have a different kind of outcome. Now, so that's my first, if you like, I know it's maybe a small measure of hope, but it is, I think, something we need to always remember. On the question of Palestine, I can be more confident here, because I think that despite all the problems that I've outlined, despite the weakness of the Palestinian political leadership, despite the fragmentation, despite the deepening of control that I've discussed, that we have never before seen Israel so isolated on a global scale. Okay, we've never seen Israel in such a situation where it has no political sustenance. I'm not talking about governments here, I'm talking about everyday people, okay, across the world. This is new. Right? It didn't happen yesterday, it didn't happen in the last 5 years, it's been happening over a period of time, but it is new. And this is, I think, a very significant factor that we must always remember. One of the reasons for this is, of course, the BDS movement, the boycott, divestment and sanctions movement, and we've seen some enormous successes in the BDS movement over recent years. And we're seeing this admitted to by the Israeli government and by other institutions. We know, for example, the UN released a report last year, where they said that the reduction in Israel's foreign direct investment, it was a reduction of 46% in 2014. Lying behind that was BDS as a key factor. Okay, almost 50% drop in FDI. We see the World Bank coming out with a report where they talk about BDS as a key factor in a drop of Israel's exports. Okay, We see the Israeli government and the RAND Corporation, a big think tank, noting that BDS will cost Israel, or has potential to cost Israel, billions of dollars. Okay, these are not small activist organizations. They are financial institutions that are quite openly speaking about this erosion of any kind of vision of Israel as being a progressive symbol. Okay, and we need to remember that 50 years ago, for much of the population, the world's population, particularly in the West, particularly in the United States, even unfortunately among the left, Israel was seen as being somewhat of a beacon of socialism or collective living. Of course, that was never true, but that was how people thought about it. That does not exist today, okay, except in a tiny minority, a disappearing minority. Okay, that is, I think, a massive achievement. We see Veolia, for example, sell off all its businesses in Israel in response to, of course, the movement. We see telecoms giant Orange likewise saying it will pull out of Israel by 2017. We see G4S, of course, to be hated for many different reasons, but G4S stating that they will reduce, I mean, it's still unclear exactly what they're going to do, but they've talked about pulling out of parts of the prison so that they operate within Israel. So now, of course, in response to this, and very much confirming what I have said, there has been a ratcheting up of the repression associated with activism around this. And I'm sure many of you know about the decisions, the various bills passed around procurement and for local councils being unable to determine, or to boycott certain companies, and also around how they spend pension funds. These kinds of repressive acts, I think, are an indication that the movement is working. Okay? To my mind, the most striking confirmation of this actually occurred last week. I don't know how many of you saw, there was an article in The Guardian, I think, and elsewhere, talking about posters that had appeared in the London Tube. Okay, did you hear about this? It was posters that were put up in the London Tube that were saying, they were done in the way that they looked like advertisements, professionally produced advertisements. They talked about Israel as an apartheid state. They talked about BDS. They talked about all sorts of things. And they were placed like adverts in the London Tube. Okay? This was done by a handful of activists, a very, very small group of people who had the idea, why don't we do this? It might be a nice kind of publicity stunt. Let's do this. The response was straight from the Israeli government to the London Council, demanding that these be removed from the London Tube. Netanyahu speaks upon it, the Israeli government speaks upon it, demanding action from the British about these posters put up by just a handful of students, probably. Okay? Now, this reaction really, I think, speaks volumes about the brittleness or fragility of how Israel sees itself in the world today. It may project its military might, but what lies behind that military might is eroding, and I think we don't realize how quickly it is eroding. So I think to that moment, I think, was very key to me. Of course, we can make analogies here with the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa, and it's very, I think, revealing to know, for example, that Margaret Thatcher tried to introduce the same legislation that Cameron has introduced around local councils back under her tenure. She failed, I believe, at that time, but it's the same attempt to push back a movement that is actually winning. We shouldn't also forget that David Cameron in 1989 took a junket trip to South Africa, apartheid South Africa, paid for by a lobby firm, a pro-apartheid lobby firm, to basically go and visit the South African apartheid government. This is 1989, remember, just a few years before the end of, at least the formal end, of apartheid. So these, I think, are signs in the wind. Okay, and these are things that I think we should always always remember. They are, I think, of course, they don't happen out of the blue. They are a testimony to collective solidarity of people, and I'm sure many people in this room are involved in some of these campaigns that I've discussed. But to my mind, this kind of collective solidarity, this kind of international solidarity, is the golden thread that ties Tom and the life of Tom to what we are trying to do here today. Thank you.
Yeah, and thank you for this excellent lecture, which gave us deep insight into the architecture of occupation and current struggles, the escalation of the struggle in Palestine, and also about the regional economic and political dynamics, which to a certain extent determine what is possible for the Palestinian struggle. So I'm, happy to invite questions, comments, thoughts, and I hope we will have a, interesting discussion about the thesis and the thoughts which we have been, which we have been happy to listen to.
First of all, thank you very much for the talk this evening. You talked earlier about how the billboards have changed from being political slogans to advertising for various businesses and stuff like that. And another thing which I've noticed around a lot of the narratives around Palestine is that it's become depoliticised and shifted more towards a kind of a humanitarian narrative. It's become more about the devastation, we have to provide aid. It's not a political problem, it's a humanitarian problem. What do you think, following on for those 2 points, what do you think is the relationship between depoliticising Palestine and neoliberal development in the Gaza Strip and the West Bank?
We can take a few now.
See somebody.
Yeah, just to say thanks a lot, brilliant. And I've read the book and it's fantastic, and it's one of the rare analyses of linking up to the wider region, which I think we should be very interested in. The main point is we're always talking about the PA and how that's going to change quite soon, one way or the other. It's desired by a lot of people that the Palestinian Authority is dismantled or ends basically. This is looking like many commentators are suggesting this. What is that desired right now? What would be the ramifications? And is it possible then that an ANC-style group, or is there anything suggesting that eventually could come about whereby actually there's more of a connection between the BDS movement, the international solidarity, and the leadership on the ground?
Yes, I don't quite know how to phrase this question, but from the perspective of Britain and of Europe, there seems to be a competition of concern, like public concern, particularly because devastation of the war in Syria and of the refugees and of the scale of the refugees, the number of people who are living in Jordan and in Turkey. And it would seem to me that acts in competition for public concern here, and that's one of the reasons why perhaps interest in the fight of Palestinians at the moment is at a low stage, because people's interest and concern is with the refugees and what's going on in Syria. So that's not a question, but in a way, it's what I thought you were going to talk about, because from my perspective here, or from an ordinary person, that's what it looks like. That's the bigger and more urgent issue.
My question, it's very hard to get condense it, let me do my very best for you, is about the wider Arab world that you really only briefly touched on. Although thanks for coming with it all. I'm totally pessimistic, and I don't see any of your optimistic outcomes at all. The simple question that I keep being asked, in one form or another, is who are the good kinds? There are no good kinds. There is nobody that ordinary people in the West feel that they can support. Assad, for instance, who was never a very good dictator, but he wasn't as bad as a lot of other people who've been completely demonised. The whole Shia Crescent, Tony Blair plot to stop arms from Iran to Hezbollah is what started this off. Obama's solution of moderate Islamic governments through the Brotherhood, particularly in Egypt, has completely failed. I mean, there is, the tiny numbers of liberal Western Democrats in the Arab countries who are supposed to be our rebels hardly exist, have no power, aren't supported by the population, who look broadly support increasingly violent Islamists of all different shapes. Turkey, a NATO power, now supports ISIS, probably did from the beginning, as a counterweight to losing its Muslim Brotherhood power and against Saudi Arabia. It is hard to condense, isn't it? Because there's a lot of stuff going on. But what on earth is the solution even possibly going to be that's going to be allowed to sit there by Western powers?
Can you take one more? Yes, sort of. And then we maybe wrap it up and then the next talk.
Mine's kind of on a similar thing to Aily's in terms of kind of obviously with apartheid for South Africa, you had the ANC to kind of support, especially as internationals. But you mentioned about kind of the increased elitism within places like Ramallah, and we had Iyad come and visit, and Iyad's an activist in Berlin, and there are lots of people who are kind of on the ground fighting every day. So how do you think the best way would be to kind of unify Palestinians, those who are kind of more protected from the occupation? That's possibly not the right phrasing, but compared to lots of people who live in kind of Area C, who live right next to settlements and who are kind of fighting or protesting peacefully kind of every day, how do you kind of think there is a way to unify those movements?
Yeah. Okay. Very good questions and not very easy questions. So I might actually begin with this, because a couple of people asked about the PA and about and the final question about how to actually unify Palestinians as a whole. I think that one of the consequences that we didn't really have time to speak about, although I mentioned it, was this differentiation within Palestinian society that you pointed out. And I think it's interesting to look over the last 5 years, okay, maybe a little bit longer than 5 years. We see increasingly that differentiation played out in Palestinian politics. And I mean by this the emergence of movements, often youth movements. And I'm not saying that these are going to be the things that go on. They come and they go. But they emerge around the kinds of questions that were asked around this differentiation, about the impact of neoliberal reform, for example, about the introduction of water meters into people's houses, about the high food prices, about the way that salaries for public sector workers debt is automatically taken out of your account every month. These kinds of things, these kinds of reforms that have occurred in Palestine just as much, and perhaps to some extent even deeper, than they have elsewhere in the region. Okay, this kind of neoliberal economic program. Protests around this, popular discontent around this, is being seen for the first time throughout the West Bank and Gaza Strip, West Bank in particular. That's new. Okay, it wasn't like that before, and these are not necessarily new reforms. Okay, but they are certainly at the core of the way the PA state building project is articulated. So that, I think, is something that now where they will go, how it will be expressed politically. It's not something necessarily that the mainstream or that the political factions are necessarily involved in, they're new movements. So I think that's quite, for example, there's a new trade union movement, an independent trade union movement, that is quite promising, in my opinion, that's active across the West Bank and Gaza Strip. Excellent worker. I mean, it's not just 100 people, it's tens of thousands of people. They are not linked to the political factions in the way the old trade union movement was. They're trying to build from the base up. These kinds of things are positive signs. Okay, so I think that's partly how we might see that unifying happening. The other thing I would say, though, is that, again, to emphasize the point I was trying to make in the talk, is that we need to move beyond just looking at the West Bank and Gaza Strip and look for the answer there. I don't think the answer is going to be only there, okay? Precisely because of the processes I described, this fragmentation, encirclement. We need to look much more widely across, in the case of Palestinian politics, across the Palestinian people as a whole. So that means Palestinians here, Palestinians in Jordan, in Lebanon, and elsewhere. Okay. Now, the PLO basically it exists, but it's a shell. Okay. What kind of new political form might Palestinian political organization take? I don't know, but I am certain you speak to Palestinians, everyone says yes, that's what we need. Okay. It will happen, I think. But it's something that I think is going to be a process that, everyone recognizes exactly the question you asked, it's on everyone's mind. There will be a solution found to it, but how it arises, it will be engaging with solidarity movements, it will be engaging with the kinds of movements I spoke about in the Arab world, and also these new movements in the West Bank and Gaza. So, again, the complicated, someone asked about the dismantlement of the PA. It's not an easy thing to speak about there, because many people actually depend upon the PA for their livelihood. And that's one of the ways this system has actually evolved, in the sense that the PA has become completely dependent upon external capital flows from either tax receipts from Israel or foreign aid and donor aid. Okay, which means it's part of the story of this political subservience of the institution as a whole. Okay, it's very, very important understanding how this has happened. But it means that people are tied into it in some way. Okay, and a collapse of that institution might have a very bad impact. So it's not an easy thing to say. I mean, we can all point out the problems with the PA as an institution. But it's not an easy thing to say, okay, let's just... I think we need to look more at building a political alternative. Now, there was a question about... refugees, and which is obviously a very... you're absolutely right. I mean, that is the key political question today in Europe, and also in the Arab world, Lebanon, Jordan, and elsewhere. It's obviously the key thing. But I would say around that is that we need to move beyond a humanitarian view of this. It's a political question, okay? And we need to look at why people are leaving the region. I mean, obviously it's to do with war, it's to do with conflict, it's to do with displacement, it's to do with the failures of the uprisings that I spoke about, it's to do with economic program, and we need to kind of situate the refugee issue in those deeper root causes. And that, I think, actually provides a way of linking both Palestine to these other questions, okay? Because Palestinians, most Palestinians are refugees, and they have been for the last, since 48, okay? So the experience of refugees, the experience of border crossings, the experience of living in refugee camps is something that every Palestinian knows. And it's pointing out these commonalities, I think. You're right, at the immediate level, people's immediate political action might be much more to do with, and rightly so in many ways, to do with the issue of migration and refugees in Europe, absolutely. But I think we need to always try to build those connections between our campaigns. It's not. I mean, there's not an easy way to do it. I'm not trying to give an easy answer here, but I think it's something we have to keep in mind. Because I'm sure we all know, those of us who are active around Palestine, yourselves, people come into the Palestine movement in diverse ways. They don't just come, okay, I got interested in Palestine one day. They come, maybe they've gone to a refugee event, or they've gone to some other kinds of political event, and they actually come to understand these linkages and decide that's what they want to become involved in. So I think that's something we should keep in mind. There was a question also about the change, that's the neoliberal development. I mean, I think you're absolutely right in terms of this shift. I mean, it's not a new shift towards looking at Palestine, to presenting it in this kind of humanitarian perspective, and the role that aid plays in all of this. But I would just, again, I want to stress this point about very closely linked to this depoliticization. Maybe a better term to use is atomization, if you like, or individualization, in the sense that what has happened, and this always happens with debt, this is what debt does. If you increase debt levels, if you increase people's dependencies on financial markets, they are more concerned about meeting the next paycheck, meeting the next bank payment, than they are about collective struggle. Okay, we know this here. It's not just in Palestine. It is very present in Palestine. But the thing is that this is not a stable system. We also know that here. It's something that will, there's a bubble. There's a debt bubble in Palestine. And its collapse, I think, will happen, or its puncturing will happen. And that's where we might see also some of these new movements linked to it. Because there's a lot of people making a lot of money out of this debt too. Banks and so forth, the same as here. Okay, finally, the question about who are the good guys, and it's a very good question. Who are the good guys? And it's not easy to point to say, okay, this person or that person or this group or that group. But what I would say, two things I would say. One is that we need to look beyond the people, the leaders that we see. We shouldn't look for the good guys in the governments of the Middle East. Okay. Obviously, we shouldn't look for them in ISIS or anything else either. What we need to recognize is that people, normal people, continue to struggle, continue to find ways. Okay, that is true. Okay, I'm sure all of us here have met people like that in the region. That's who the good guys are. They don't have a banner or a political program at this moment necessarily. They may have, but it's not something that it's like we see on TVs. But they exist and they're organizing. We see them on the streets. Okay, we see them in Egypt, we see them in Syria, we see them in Bahrain, we see them in Palestine. Okay, that's to my mind where the good guys are going to come from. Yes, they're a minority, absolutely. But the point I made at the beginning of my lecture is the function of pessimism is to self-perpetuate a bleak situation. It reinforces a bleak situation. So I think we need to realize that it's people on the ground. Certainly, and I'm very thankful for this, the liberal Western Democrats you speak of, yes, they are not the good guys. I completely agree with you. And we should not look to them to be the good guys, because those are the people that actually, they may appear to be liberal Western Democrats, but in reality, what they do is they rely upon authoritarian rule, and that's that's the way development is in the Middle East. Okay, and that's something we need to take to really internalize, I think. Sorry.
Thank you. Any further comments or questions? So, what choose the 4, 5? Yeah.
You mentioned in your talk, the first part of it, that the Oslo Accord, the sense was a strategy to atomize the West Bank. And that's the possibility of a two-state solution wasn't there. That was perhaps a bit of self-delusion by the Palestinian Authority. If that was part of the strategy of Israel to establish the Palestinian Authority essentially as a gendarme, effectively, what then is, you think Israel will be trying to sustain that at this current time, and it looks as though it's actually destabilising it. So I wonder, what your thoughts as to what will happen when the Palestinian Authority collapses. Presumably, the Israeli government knows this is going to take place, and what do they plan? And do they plan another round of ethnic cleansing, or what?
Okay. I'm optimistic about the effect that the BDS movement has and can have. What I'm less than optimistic about is the political scene throughout the rest of the world. The support for Israel politically seems to be growing. It is in Britain, it is in France, with the particular movement where you're outlawed with BDS movement. Other things in Europe where there are acts which prevent goods coming, supposed to prevent goods being exported to Europe, but it's all ignored. Then you've got in America where Obama just keeps throwing more and more money at Israel. He's thrown more money this presidency at Israel than any other president before him. Then you've got the support of the states around the Middle East, like Saudi Arabia, possibly Iran, I don't know, but certainly Egypt and places like that. And then one reads in the Halpern book about the support created by the military support that they give to other nations. I find that difficult to be optimistic.
Please, can you tell me more in detail about how children are affected?
Sure.
Thank you.
Yeah, just an observation and then a brief question. I think the shift by the Israeli government to try and tackle BDS legislatively across the West kind of shows that they've lost the battle of ideas. And that's, just talking about Israel's international legitimacy, I think that's significant. And then just the question about one state, two states. And I think there's been a shift within the solidarity movement in recent years to advocacy for one state. Do you think that's desirable? And do you think that there's a chance for success? Because I've seen written recently, some people speculating that there might be more chance for success if the Palestinians shifted from kind of a national liberation mantra to a kind of more of a civil rights type movement, one person, one vote. And there's a quote from the former Israeli Prime Minister Olmert. He said that if the Palestinians hold up a sign saying one state, one vote, the state of Israel will be finished tomorrow. So I just wondered what you thought about that.
Thank you. Thanks, Adam, for the talk. Since you mentioned it, I think I'm asking, is there a direct connection between independent trade unions in Egypt and in Palestine? Field work on independent trade unions in Egypt has been really difficult, and after the murder of PhD student Juno Reggiani from Cambridge, this has been brought up in the academic community. I'm wondering whether this very key issue in terms of class conflict and class dynamics in the Middle East region is coming out for non-Arabic speaking people, for example. What can you tell us about these connections?
Can you take one more?
Yes.
Adam, I've given this point of view of mine an airing before. But in the light of what you've told us tonight, particularly about the Oslo Accords and how they succeeded in fracturing, that was the word you used, and isolating Palestinians from each other, the net result of this, a major result of course, is the wall. And I wonder whether the Zionists understand that there are two sides to every wall. On one side, life for the Palestinians is unbearable. On the other side, have the Zionists, to give them their proper meaning, actually returned to where they were 100 years ago, the ghetto. They have also surrounded themselves and ghettoized themselves. And I wonder what you feel about that.
So, right, another A couple of good questions there. So there was the question about Oslo and the strategy, and is Israel undermining the PA, and would it, what would happen in the case of a collapse of the PA? I personally think Israel does not want the PA to collapse, and I don't think they will let it collapse. I think they will continue. Through the kinds of mechanisms that we spoke about, tax receipts being one of them, very importantly, they want to see someone like Abu Mazen in power, in charge. Now, that, of course, that means that they're very concerned about what might happen after Abu Mazen passes from the scene. But I'm quite certain that international Western governments and Israel want to have something in the form of the PA to remain in the West Bank. Okay, we can see this through the close security cooperation that happens between Israel and the PA. That has happened since the establishment of the PA. We can see it in the repression of the PA, of political activists and of protests. We can see it in the very kind of muted political positions that the PA adopts. I don't think there's any kind of sense that they would want that to disappear. But just to bring that to also you raised the two-state solution, and someone else raised issue of, the one-state solution. I think that, this question often arises. Should we advocate for a one-state solution? Doesn't that make the most sense? And I think there's a lot of arguments in favor of that, in the sense that it pushes back against the fragmentation that I spoke about. It makes very clear that Palestinians inside Israel, citizens of Israel, are Palestinians and need to be thought of as Palestinians, are part of the Palestinian movement. I 100% agree with that. It makes sense from and as many people have pointed out, from a political, strategic perspective, because you're calling for this kind of one vote thing, and trying to remodel it on the basis of an anti-apartheid struggle, the South African anti-apartheid struggle. I think all of those are valid points. My concerns are twofold in regards to that. One, I think, again, that often the one-state, two-state solution is seen only in the context of Palestine and Israel. Okay, it's not seen in the regional context. I'm going to keep on harping about this. That we need to look at the way we actually need a regional transformation. Okay, that's where the blockages are. All right, it's not. We can't just come up with the right political slogan and that's going to change the situation. So that's one concern of mine with that. My second concern is that I think this is. It's got to be a Palestinian-led discussion in terms of what is this vision going to be. Now, there are Palestinians, obviously, who support one-state solution. You won't find many that will praise the Oslo process or praise what's on the ground at the moment. That's certainly true. There have been various polls saying, increasing levels of support for one state. But I think it's not the job of the solidarity movement to come and say, look, this should be what our slogan is, or what the slogan is. I actually think the demands of the BDS movement do it best. Everyone knows we have 3 demands around the BDS movement: right of return of refugees, full equality for Palestinian citizens, and end of military occupation. To my mind, those 3 demands encapsulate all parts of the Palestinian body. Inside West Bank and Gaza Strip, the refugees. And it gets around. You could make an argument that it leads logically to a one-state solution, but it gets around needing to say, I support one state or I support two state, which I think in some ways is not the right argument to be having. It's an interesting and good argument and discussion to have, but I don't think it should be a dividing line for the solidarity movement. Very good question about children. And what's life like for children? Well, it's very, I mean, life is very difficult, as I've spoken about. It's difficult, for example, to go to school, It's difficult to find places to play. It's difficult for many years. We have to remember, if you are a child in the West Bank and you are, let's say, actually more than that. I mean, if you are under the age of, say, 15 years old, you probably have never seen the sea, okay? If you're in the West Bank. Because unless you know someone who has a permit and can get out, you haven't seen the sea. But at the same time, we need to remember that children are children everywhere. And so they play, they have fun, and, you know, it's, yeah. So, and I think the part of the hope that I was speaking about is that, the hope that children have. Yeah. But we can talk more about that. But a very good question. Okay, the question on Israel's internal situation. Yes, I didn't really speak about that much tonight, and I probably should have brought that up a bit more, because you're right. Certainly, you know, this. I mean, I feel we always say Israel's moving in a rightward militarist direction. It seems like we've been saying this. You know, Israel's moving in a right-wing militarist direction for the last 15 years. Every time you hear a talk, they talk about it. And maybe at some point we have to ask, when is that? I mean, can you just keep moving in this direction? But it's certainly true that one of the aspects of the wall and the kind of the breaking or the ghettoization is, I think, a sharpening of the right-wing policies. Of course, we see increased repression against the Palestinian population in Israel. You know, the laws that have been passing through the Knesset about expressing support for BDS, working with movements outside the country, all of that is very true. I mean, again, just to make the point that I really think the Palestinian citizens are extremely important to the Palestinian struggle as a whole. And very often that part of the Palestinian people gets left out. So it's something that we need to always write. The other thing is, you know, in terms of Israel, if we're talking about the refugee question, migration, and the treatment of migrants in Israel, you know, it's if you like, I mean, what we're seeing in Europe, we saw in Israel 4 years ago. The same kinds of patterns, same kind of rhetoric. So I think there are also those parallels to be made. And finally, the question on independent trade unions. There are, I think, some hopeful signs, you know, across the region of new labour movements. And I don't want to blow this out of proportion. I don't want to say, you know, that you know, there's this big movement burgeoning or anything. But there are, I think, embryos of you know, positive signs in numerous countries. And I think, again, we often forget about labour struggles, worker struggles in the region. But I know there are contacts between them, but there's no, as far as I'm aware, any kind of formal linkages established. That would be, I think, something that will inevitably happen at some point, depending how these movements evolve. I mean, you're certainly right in terms of research on those struggles. It's very, particularly in Egypt, it's extremely difficult at the moment. And it relates to this point I was making about the brittleness of the Egyptian regime. You know, they are arresting people left, right, and centre, killing people, torturing people, military courts. This is happening left, and this kind of repression is a reflection of a regime that is scared. Okay, that is worried about its power. There's one question I forgot around the effect of BDS. Yes, who said, yes, you asked the question. I think you're absolutely right. I agree with everything you said, up to a point. I agree with the fact that there is all of this repressive legislation coming through across Europe. I agree with the point about the the local regimes and their alliances with Israel, particularly the Gulf, absolutely. But again, I would say we should not look to what governments are doing as the sign of popular opinion. Okay, these governments don't represent us, and they don't reflect, in my opinion, the sea change that has happened at the level of everyday people. Okay, that's what they are responding to. The government's, this repression is a response to that sea change in popular opinion. Now, is it going to be successful? Are they going to be successful in clamping down on a council here, or preventing a student group from holding a meeting? Or yes, probably in many cases they will be successful at that particular moment in time. But again, this is this is a sign that something is working. Okay. The thing is, how do we build a campaign that can deal with those the repression that's undoubtedly coming down, and at the same time draw connections with other movements that are facing similar repression? Like, let's not forget, the thing around councils is related very much also to the environmental movement. It's not just Palestine that's being targeted here. It's fossil fuel divestment that's also being targeted. On campuses, we see Prevent unfolding, where speakers have to be vetted, and it's very easy. Someone was telling me the other day that there was in a high school, a young 15-year-old boy was taken. I don't know if he was arrested or for wearing a Palestine badge. Okay, in high school student. Okay, so this is the kind of thing that we're seeing. We need to find ways of building linkages across the campaigns.
Thank you. Are there any more questions or comments? Yeah, one more. I think we could take maybe 1, 2 more, maximum 3 would be my suggestion, and then we could wrap up. Yeah, we've got one more here, and the third question over there. Thank you. You're very a fourth one?
Okay.
A fourth one, sorry. We're milking you. Okay, I think somebody here was...
Do you think the BDS movement and the end to the occupation is best served by a vote Leave or vote Remain, or which won't have it?
I was wondering if someone was going to...
Do you agree that there's kind of a tendency to boycott movements to kind of over-exaggerate the importance of the international solidarity the boycott against South Africa and ending apartheid? I think that can kind of diminish the agency of the Palestinians and the South Africans in liberating themselves. Do you agree?
Yeah. It's kind of a two-pronged question. It's about the effects on Palestine and Israel with how they've been affected by the rise of Daesh. For example, as far as I'm aware, there's been no military attacks by Daesh on Israel, although they have attacked Palestinian refugees in Syria, for example in Yarmouk. And also, as far as I'm aware, Israel hasn't accepted any refugees. I just wondered if you could speak about that.
I was wondering how the politics is developing specifically within Gaza, particularly with no borders open, no rebuilding of the Gaza itself, and so many refugees and people living without homes. I wonder how the politics is developing within that environment.
All right. The vote Leave, vote Remain. Honestly, I'm not sure. I don't have an answer to that question. I am not an expert on European law. I think that's where you're aiming at in terms of how it might affect. I guess in both sides, the British government's direction is not obviously in a positive direction, regardless of the EU, and likewise the EU, I think, is moving in, again, someone noted the right-wing direction or more repressive direction. So I don't know the specifics. It's an interesting point to ask, though. Yes, on the agency of BDS. That's also a very good question. I always think it's important to remember that the BDS movement wasn't born in 2004, I think it was, when the Boycott National 5, yes, you're right, when the Boycott National statement came out. It wasn't born at that moment. In fact, key to the Palestinian national struggle since its inception has been the idea of no anti-normalization. Okay, you don't normalize with Israel. It's been a foundational principle, certainly of the left. I'm not saying that all Palestinian political parties and leaders have followed this anti-normalization thing, but it has been a foundational principle. So I always look at the BDS movement as actually being reflecting or encapsulating that aspect of the Palestinian movement. And and that, I think, partly gets to your question of it's actually an Arab or Palestinian led struggle. Okay, it's not something that's coming from outside. The point you're making, though, about the South African apartheid, I agree with you. We often it wasn't just the isolation, and it certainly wasn't just the economic impact on South Africa. And obviously there's differences between the South African struggle and the Palestinian struggle, largely again to do with labor. Actually is a big part of this, but yeah, it's a point well taken. Yes, I mean the two-pronged question. Yes, as far as, I mean, there was a video put out by ISIS. When was it? Maybe October or something, where they threatened Israel, and there's been a few kind of videos on that level. But yeah, as far as I'm aware, there's been no military attacks. I might be wrong, but not that I'm aware of. And yes, also as far as I'm aware, Israel's taken no refugees from. This is the right of return in terms of Palestinian refugees. That's kind of it goes to the core of the identity of the Israeli state. Politics in Gaza. I think some of the trends that I noted in my talk about differentiation of the Palestinian population, I think you can certainly see in Gaza as well. At least I haven't been there for a long time. It's very difficult to get in, but at least from people that I speak to there or people who have been there, they talk about the increasing differentiation of wealth in Gaza, related much to the way that Qatar is funding some of the reconstruction and where that money is going from Qatar. It also relates to the tunnel economy. Tunnels are not there or playing the same kind of role as they used to, but certainly when the tunnels were operating at full capacity a few years ago, there was a lot of there was a whole economy that developed around those tunnels. It's fascinating and important politically to look at how that developed. But I do think, again, this is what I've heard from people who have been there and people who live there, that there is an increasing discontent, if you like, with Hamas and the Hamas leadership in Gaza. Partly to do with these economic problems, partly to do with the kind of more repressive social policies of the government. But yeah, I don't think they offer any kind of viable alternative, at least to the PA. Okay, that's it.
Okay. Yeah, and thank you very much for your analysis. There are a few copies available for Lineages of Revolt. It's difficult to resist the temptation after this talk. So talk to Adam, and also, he is merchandise and goods produced in Palestine on sale. And thank you very much for being here and making this event possible on an annual basis. Thank you.